Sound coming through okay?
Yes, sir, I can hear you.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Then if I can find everything, we can dig in. We're going to look at Islam tonight. We'll look mostly at the history. And we'll use there's nothing. Okay. Hang on a minute, y'all. We're not getting everything here. I don't know why it doesn't do that.
Yeah, it's on.
Okay. Okay. Islam has a historical beginning. In the 6th century, 500s after the birth of Jesus, it develops in the life of Muhammad, a man who was born in 570. They think he was a member of one of the clans in the city of Mecca in Saudi Arabia, an important family. They had control over the Kaaba, which was one of the many, many sacred sites in Mecca. It's a rock, probably a meteorite. But it was just one of many. The culture of the day had not been impacted to any significant degree by Christianity. even though Christianity had had 5 centuries to get there. It was there in places, but in Saudi Arabia, it had not had any major outreach. Critics of Christianity have various explanations for that. I'm inclined to believe that a great deal of it had to do with the fact that since the 4th century, Christianity in the Roman Empire, with some extensions south into Ethiopia, for instance, northeast into the Slavic countries, some degree. It was well established in Syria, and then, of course, had moved into Northern Europe, as well as across North Africa. But much of that growth had occurred in the first 3-4 centuries in terms of its expansion. As we saw with its rise of acceptance in the Roman Empire in the 4th century, Christianity found it too easy to get itself caught up in major theological debates, which produced division, and too much of the steam was taken out of its evangelism. It had other priorities, unfortunately. Judaism, of course, had never been significantly evangelistic, even though it has grown some, and in fact, that it was still in significant numbers in the Mesopotamian Valley. But Saudi Arabia, of course, is south of that. And there weren't a lot of Jews who had moved into Saudi Arabia. They are there, as we're going to see. But again, they had no real outreach. Persia, of course, has had influence in the area since 500 years before Jesus' time. The major religion of Persia is Zoroastrianism. Again, was fairly significantly distributed among the aristocratic peoples, but it was not popularly involved in any significant degree. The religious environment, as Smith describes it in Arabia, was still what's called spiritism or animism, in terms of there were spiritual beings in existence, frequently connected with all of the objects, things, and frequently free-floating. The response to them was a great deal of magic, since many of these spirits were visioned in a very negative way. They were seen as demonic powers. There was still the carryover of the natural gods, which of course attached to all the natural objects and activities, and were worshipped still with some degree of idolatry. But there was no central or common religion. Was much like we'll find it in the Middle East with Hinduism. While Hinduism has kind of an overarching commonality and structure. In reality, among the people, there's a whole variety of who they worship, how they worship, and that kind of thing. So there was a multiplicity of religious experiences, most of them with negative ethical implications and applications. Third, fourth, fifth century life in Saudi Arabia was in many ways not very pleasant. If you haven't already read the part of the chapter where Smith talks about Islam and women, you will find when you get there that with all of the Western negatives that we could apply to Islam and frequently do with respect to women, Smith is quick to point out that Islam was worlds ahead better for women than what existed prior. It was not a good scene. There was no cohesive social structure. Saudi Arabia was inhabited by clans, tribes, small outreach in the desert. Most of your income came from what you could steal from somebody else. And of course, that meant you were being robbed all the time too. So there wasn't a very positive environment in that part of the country, as you find world over, before any kind of major civilization begins to emerge. That kind of small community, village tribes, small alliances that are constantly in conflict with each other, stealing people as well as money and goods, is pretty common, was pretty common the world over. Into this, Muhammad is born. Apparently, all the descriptions that survive of him, he was a significantly sensitive person who ultimately displays great social skills. Spiritually, religiously, he appears to have been a part of one of the religious groups of the day that dealt in meditation. And one of the sites outside of Mecca was a cave frequented by people for all kinds of reasons. In the story of Islam, in the month of Ramadan in 610, a growing sensitivity that somehow a God, the true God, the major God, there was in the mythology of the day a supreme God, and Muhammad becomes convinced, experiences the revelation of this God, who on this one particular night, it's very vivid to him that he's to proclaim in the name of your Lord who created created man from the clod of blood. Proclaim, your Lord is most generous, who teaches by the pen, teaches man what he did not know. And that's the foundation of Islam. The proclamation that there is only one true God, the Allah. Smith gives you the derivation of that word. It's the Arabic article, definite article, and their word for God, which is associated with the Hebrew word for God, El. And convinced that he's supposed to make this declaration, he begins doing it there in Mecca, receiving tidbits of revelation along the way, which not only involves then the declaration that there really is one singular deity to whom humanity ought to be responsive. There develops the clear monotheism. This God is alone, and out of his reality, humans are his creatures and therefore responsible to him, and therefore will face sure judgment, and consequently should become responsive to this God wholeheartedly and completely, surrendering to his purpose, his will, his work. And thus, Islam gained a central morality. They take their name from their surrender to God, that's Islam. And then the person, the follower of Islam, is a Muslim, a surrendered person. Since they, much like Jews, he began to realize you can't do this by yourself. And so there's a need for social order, for community. And he's trying to develop this, but it's very, very slow. And faces considerable opposition because there were built-in interests in preserving what religious activity there was. Priesthoods of those people. Remember, in the Christian faith, you have the confrontation in Ephesus of the silversmiths who recognize that Christianity, like Judaism, challenges their idolatry, and that, of course, would eat into your business as an idol maker. And the opposition becomes quite strong in Mecca. So in 615, when he still has just a few families, some of them leave all the way to Abyssinia, Ethiopia. So his numbers are reduced even more. In 619, the wife, much older than he is, passes away, as does this uncle who has been his patron since preteen days, when his mother had died after his father had died when he was an infant. In the midst of growing opposition a delegation has heard about him in the nearby city of Yathrib, and they come down asking if he might come up and help them develop some kind of cohesive civic social order in the city. And eventually, with some difficulty, because the opposition in Mecca doesn't even want him out of town, they want to crush him. He virtually has to escape. He moves to the city and helps them create a charter of city government, to which all of the groups that now live in the city are willing to subscribe to. There's 2 Arabian quarters in the city. There's a group of Christians in the city. There are 3 Jewish quarters in the city, and then the followers of Muhammad. And they are able to create a cohesive citywide government. They still operate like they've always done, and so they support themselves by continuing to raid caravan groups. Even though Muhammad is a caravaner himself, that's been his career. That's how he got his wife. He became her chief operator of her caravan business. The people in Mecca see what's going on, and even on their own, there's this conflict between these 2 cities because they're trying to raid the same caravans that are coming through. They have skirmishes of one kind or another. Ultimately, 624, the forces of the city, which has increasingly become known as the city of the Prophet, Medina, are able to defeat the armies of Mecca, and Muhammad is able to return and purify that sacred site, the Kaaba. And let me stop there for a minute and just point out to you, if you didn't already know this, in these Hebrew and Arabic words where you have an apostrophe, that apostrophe is there to let you, the reader, know that that's really a letter in the alphabet. The reason it's put in with an apostrophe is that it is a sound that isn't represented at all in our languages, and in some cases wasn't hardly even voiced in those days. But it was a letter. And so when they spell it in their writings, there'll be a consonant there, a letter, virtually silent. And of course, you know, we have those kind of things in English too, like the P in front of Psalms. So this is really a 2-syllable word, not a 1-syllable word. In English, you could read this as simply Kaab, but it's actually 2 syllables, and you have to kind of put some kind of a breath or something in there in order to make it a 2-syllable word, to say it more like they would have said. Once he gains control of Mecca, he really ratchets up his teachings. He's still receiving them, tidbits every now and then. He's illiterate, so he can't write them down. He recites them to close followers, and they then memorize them and repeat them back to him and tell others about them and teach others what they are. But all of this is taking place verbally. Now, very early, they start writing this stuff down, but they write it as individual sayings as he brings them to them, and they write them down on whatever there is to write down at the time. So they gradually have a collection of various stuff, pieces of paper, pieces of leaves, pieces of pottery, that stuff is written down on. And it's maintained by whoever happens to have their pieces. And nobody has all the pieces. There's just this collection, free collections floating around of these sayings that he's received from God. He demonstrates a real proficiency for organization. And he develops a massive organization that covers everything, not just his followers and their religious activities and the leaders that they need there. Eventually, those leaders become imams as a title. But the armies, the government, trade, he opens a trade route all the way to China. He develops armies that are able to defeat Genghis Khan, who's making his progression from the east. And there are historians who say the only thing that saved Europe was Islam. In 632, Muhammad dies, and he has not organized a succession. And so there are immediate problems. Who should succeed him? And the first successors, there's 3 of them who take the title Caliph. Are kind of consensus leaders among the followers of Muhammad. Each one of them doesn't reign very long before he dies. But they have no direct descendant relationship to Muhammad. And there are those who feel like the leadership really should be dynastic, and a descendant of Muhammad should be the leader. And it takes a little while before that creates a major break, as we'll see in a minute, but it does. The first of these caliphs who follow him establish the principle that there can be no more prophets. And the group has to stay together. Can't have any subgroups forming, which of course proves not to work at all. The second one is the one who establishes the calendar for Islam. And they adopt a lunar calendar like the Jews have. And they start it with his leaving Mecca and going to what now is Medina. He's the one who formalizes the fundamental 5 principles of Islam that we'll look at in a minute. He also begins the process of creating meeting places for them, the mosques. The third of these caliphs is the one who decides that the emerging Quran, much of it now has been written down in book form. They've adopted the book ideal, but there are different versions, apparently. There is one that supposedly has been kept by one of his last wives, and she won't give it up to him. And so he appoints a scholar who works with a group to try to create a normative collection of the prophet's sayings. And once they have a copy, then he sends out a copy of this to all the provinces of the empire that existed at the time, which wasn't very big. This authoritative copy, and orders that all alternatives must be destroyed. And so eventually what emerges is a copy of the Quran that is then carefully copied from then on, to the place that now Islam proudly makes the claim that the Quran is different from the Christian and the Jewish scriptures, because we know that we have manuscripts of both that don't agree in every respect. Words are spelled differently, different pronouns are used, word orders are changed, and occasionally there is even a more significant change. We deal with that in the class on how we got the Bible, and show that there's nothing substantive in all of those differences. But anyway, they're there. But there aren't, quote, any known copies of a Quran that vary. Now, I sent you a fairly long article, and there's several studies that have been done on this. All kinds of arguments, pieces of evidence to try to demonstrate that that's not necessarily the historical fact, because you're talking about 100 years after Muhammad when you get to this. When that third caliph dies, this argument about succession really arises. There is descendants of one of his later wives who make a stab at being the leader of the faith. There is a section that raised a son-in-law of Muhammad. He had one surviving daughter, and her husband is put forth as a successor. This group around this Ali become the Shia or Shiite Muslims, who are followers, that's what the word means, of the family of the prophet in terms of family lineage. The opposing group call themselves the tradition, the Sunnis, and a Umayyad dynasty is built out of Islamic leaders in Damascus, which is in Syria. And they and their successors have nearly 100-year dynasty. Preserving, expanding the political reach, the evangelistic outreach. They're able to get all the way to the Mediterranean and take over that area. They make a little bit of inroads to the north in the Constantine Empire that has gone to the east and has rebuilt Constantinople, but they don't get very far. So Constantinople survives clear into the 15th century. But they then continue west and east. They go east and they conquer what has become the reestablished Persian, which is really a holdover of the Greeks of Alexander's day. They go west to Egypt and then all the way across North Africa. And by 711, they're in Spain. And by 750, they control Spain. And even after this dynasty is displaced in the Middle East, the Umayyad dynasty still survives in Spain for a couple hundred more years. The religion, of course, is the major reason for the expansion. Now, of course, there are important subsidiary things like you now get to collect taxes from all these people, and you get to collect taxes from the trade between them. So there's all kinds of empire incentives going on here. But it's clear that their religious fervor is a strong motivating force. And so it's not, they don't do like other empires and they move in and conquer you and they want your taxes. Like Rome, they don't care what you do religiously. But with Islam, they did. And so they get accused of evangelizing with the sword. It wasn't quite that aggressive initially. And because in the development of the Quran, Muhammad has received all kinds of information about this faith that includes Abraham and Israel and even Jesus as a prophet. And so the Jews and the Christians are seen as peoples of the book like Muslims were. And therefore, frequently, commonly, Jews and Christians were not forced to convert. They were second-class citizens. They were taxed heavily, but they weren't required to convert. And thus you had in Islamic land many Christians and many Jews. here's this division of the Shias and the Sunnis that I mentioned before. The dynasty that takes over next in 750 is in Baghdad. And this is the dynasty that produces Islam as a cohesive, massive, comprehensive, inclusive culture, religion, empire. And it has everything. It not only creates all of the governmental agencies, the military operations, it builds schools, universities. They, before the Europeans, rediscover Greek. And so you have a flourishing that develops them, what is still considered the golden age of Islam in 750 to 1258. Much of this recovery of Greek science and philosophy is accomplished by Jews who translate this stuff into Arabic. I remember we've had the Jewish survivors in Palestine who at that time were heavily Hellenistic in language. They did a lot of work in Greek. And so when that leadership abandons Palestine under the greater oppression of the Romans, they go east. And thus you have Jewish communities in the Mesopotamian Valley who are thoroughly aware of the Greek language. They're descendants of those people who translated the Old Testament into Greek. And so when they're given access to all this Greek material, some of which they brought with them, they translated the narrative. And so you have that by the days of the emerging Europe in the Renaissance, the Reformation, in the 1500s, this has happened in Islam in the 800s and the 900s. So the Islam of those days has more science than even Western Europe does. At this time, there develops within Islam a growing mysticism, and you have the developments of the Sufis, and we'll look at them at the end. Now, because you have comprehensive life in Judaism, you have the same thing has been happening in Islam that happened in Judaism, that happened in Christianity. You have all the old laws, all the old teachings, all the old traditions that you're having to fit into, quote, modern life. Now, of course, we're still talking about 8th century, 9th century, 10th century, 11th century, 12th century, which isn't anywhere near modern for us, but for them, it was modern. And social conditions, technology, agriculture, trade, changed. So how do you apply Islamic, Quranic law to these new conditions? And so in this period of Islam, you have this arising of their attempts to deal with this and their development of all kinds of legal codes to to apply, and you have Sharia law. I need to take a minute just to mention that I didn't at the beginning. This difference between Quran spelled this way, and here's that apostrophe, which represents a Arabic consonant that they don't pronounce hardly. And so it frequently gets transliterated into English as Quran, period. And Quran is the same as the older spelling that we English had, Koran, Koran, which is strictly a matter of what letters we use to transliterate their letters. And it's felt that our Q better represents their letter than our K. And so you get now Quran instead of Koran. A number of years ago, when this semi-Islamic application in America among blacks arose, and you had Black Islam, for a while, interestingly enough, they were called Muslims, and the Middle Easterners were still being called Muslims, M-O-S, Muslim. And you had the distinction between the two groups. This black group in America were Muslims. The real religion was called Muslim. That's obviously disappeared completely because now the linguists had decided that the U better represents the sound than the O, and so we have Muslim. I've included, I sent you, let me get out of this for just a minute. Because let's go on and take the 9th to the 11th century. There has been this significant migrations of people from the East, all the way from Iran. And they have moved into what is now Turkey, named after them, to Anatolia, Asia Minor in the New Testament days. And they have developed a growing military power independent of this dynasty of Muslims in Damascus. And so you have this internal conflict, which eventually is going to make some major changes politically, even though the religion is still Islam. So let me bring up this other document that I sent you that gives you a slight overview of that. And there are places that you can pursue that. Let me see, where'd it go? Show all the, well, it was here. Here we go. Here is a little chart of the major empires and dynasties of the Islamic world. And you can see here around 1,000, you have 3 competing dynasties. Religion is the same. Well, with, of course, all the major differences that you have in ethnic groups and all kinds of that. We'll look at that in just a minute. But the political arrangement is changing. Who's got to be top dog politically? Who got to collect the taxes and that kind of thing? This goes all the way down to the 1900s. At the same time that's happening politically, you have the same thing happening religiously. And that's this chart: Islamic schools and branches. We've already had this Sunni Shia division. And each of these, and actually there's another third one clear over here to the side from very early days. And I mentioned to you that in that third dynasty, there were real questions. Well, even in the first dynasty, there were questions about whether immediate descendants of Muhammad should be in there. And that's basically what's the fight over these divisions. This is by far the largest numerically, the Sunnis. Like 85% of Islam is Sunni. Shia takes up more room here simply because they have split over a whole variety of things, and so they're all broken up. And then within all of these, there are all kinds of variations. Part of this is ethnic, because now you're talking about all the way from North Africa to Iran, and eventually they go all the way to Indonesia. So the country with the most Muslims today is not even in the Middle East, it's Indonesia. And you get all the different kinds of flavors that involves. And you have within these the same kind of thing we saw in first century Judaism, scholars disagreeing over this, that, and the other thing, like we developed, and especially Protestant Christianity. It's not quite as obvious, but there is the same kind of thing even in Roman Catholicism. Different, quote, schools of thought, schools of interpretation. And Islam has all of this kind of stuff going on. Okay, let me see if I can get back to where I was. It's these Anatolian invaders who militarily become significant forces within Islam. And when the Crusades begin to develop, and attack in the 11th century, the late 1000s. It's those armies that begin to recover things. And so it's a Turk who develops this Ottoman Empire and gradually absorbs most all of Islam politically, geographically, and he does it partly on the basis of their being the ones who successfully drive the Christians out of the Holy Land, their Holy Land. Remember, by now, it's developed within Islam that Palestine is the Holy Land of the Muslims too. It's there that Muhammad sent it. And thus the place has become the real conflict between the two faiths. The Ottoman Empire crushes finally the old Roman Empire, Constantinople, takes over the city, renames it Istanbul. And the last vestiges of Roman control in Anatolia collapses. The Ottoman Empire makes its foray into Europe, gets all the way to the Danube, and creates the whole issue that we now have in what was Yugoslavia and all those Slavic states. You have these Slavs who were not Arabs, but they're Islam, they're Muslim. This is the defeat of Genghis Khan in 1260, the conqueror of Constantinople in 453, and thus you have the largest empire expands in 1400s into Indonesia and Malaysia, into Iran, and then you get this interesting situation in Iran that this is old Persia. Becomes nationalistic. And Arabic is displaced with Farsi, old Persian language. And I don't know what the impetus was. I haven't had a chance to look into that. Iran becomes overwhelmingly Shia. In the early part of the 20th century, Islam, the Ottoman Empire, became an ally of Germany, Italy, and those forces. So when the Western allies won the war, the Ottoman Empire is in defeat, is one of the defeated countries, empires, and the place is chopped up. And the current countries of the Middle East are all the result of that treaty of the First World War, with the exception of the modern state of Israel, which at that time was made simply a British protectorate. But that protectorate, the country of Lebanon, the country of Jordan, the country of Syria, of Iraq and Iran, Saudi Arabia, and all those little emirates around the bottom of Saudi Arabia, all that's the result of World War I. In the Middle East, well, it included Egypt, Libya, all in North Africa. Those countries in North Africa, Algeria, became a French protectorate. Libya, Egypt, the Sinai, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and all those little emirates around the bottom of Saudi Arabia. That's all the product of the treaties of World War I. And even though they're all Islam religiously, officially even, you have tremendous difference. Turkey is included in that. I forgot them. Turkey in the early 20th century abandoned Arabic and returned to a Turkish language. So they now speak Turk. Iran went back to Farsi. Most of the rest of it, I think, stayed Arabic, but I'm not sure about that. But you still have within all those countries residues of ethnic groups that were there when Islam came in, who are still like Indian tribes in Mexico that aren't Hispanic, they don't speak Spanish, they don't have any European blood in them, and you still have some of that. But you have a solid religion, but one that's fragmented. And so you have major conflict now between Saudi Arabia and Iran over Yemen, all of whom are Islamic, but significant Islamic differences that feed their political, ethnic issues. And so in many respects, Islam is worse off than Protestantism is in Christianity. And within that, you see, you get the fundamentalist conservative issue, just like you have. So you have Islamic people who do not feel that others are being Islamic enough and are perfectly willing to persecute them to whatever degree they think is necessary to get them converted. The Afghanistan is the perfect example of that now. The Afghanistan government, while America was there, was Islamic. The Taliban are Islamic. But they obviously had great disagreement between them and among them as to how that Islamic life should be lived. But it's all Islam. And so a great deal of the fear that the Western world has of Islam is generated by these more radical groups that for a lot of modern Americans are exact counterparts to these left-winging radicals and these right-wing radicals that we have in the United States. Great deal of the what's the word I want? social difference and conflict in this country is an exact counterpart to the kind of thing you see in Islam. Okay. As a background for what we'll look at in more detail next week when we talk about the faith itself. The authority, the fundamental authority in Islam is, of course, the Quran, which they have no difficulty upholding as a miracle book, because it comes from an absolute illiterate, they say. There are some people who want to debate that a little bit, but it's not debated much. He gives this, as we've said, verbally, bit by bit, piece by piece, to people who write it down. And it turns out that when the book is finally finished, it is the purest Arabic that exists. Now, saying that, you have to remember that there may be a little bit going on with that, like was going on with the King James version of the Bible in English. For us old folk who grew up on the King James, you will find many among us who praise it because that's really, really good English. Well, it's good English because the English conformed to the King James. Because the King James Bible was so prolifically used in public life in a numerous way, and its stories and its language and its figures and its metaphors became so much a part of the English language, it became the gold standard of English language because it's what the English language was built around. And the same may be true of the Arabic of the Quran. It's the gold standard of the golden age of Arabic because Arabic was built around it. But anyway, it's still upheld. And Smith has a long passage about one of the features that make the Quran so impactful is its language. When it got written down finally, it was divided into 114 surahs, so-called chapters. And they're arranged in the order of their length. So the one that has the most verses to it is the first one, and the one that has the next most verses is the second one, and so on down the line. The Quran is again seen as superior to the Bible and the Hebrew Bible because those two works have a whole lot of history in them. And the legal stuff is often stated by Moses or by Paul or by Jesus. Whereas the Quran is way, way overwhelmingly the straight statements of God, of Allah. There are touches of history here and there, but most all of its teachings and its practices are set forth as statements of God. Now, even in the earliest days, they remembered a lot of other things that Muhammad wrote or were written about him. that were preserved and held important. And that tradition in Arabic is called the Hadith. And it's a major authority. And then, of course, as we mentioned, through the centuries, you've had all of these rulings by various Islamic scholars over how to understand and apply, especially apply, the Quran, and in a few cases, the Hadith. And there are various schools of this, so they don't agree. So you have in them the same kind of thing you have in traditional Judaism. Rabbi so-and-so says this, but Rabbi so-and-so says this. And there may even be a third rabbi who's quoted, who differs from both of the other two. This is its authority. Now, while you have this length of material, this corpus of material, that's pretty extensive. The practical life of Islam was built around these 5 pillars that are the fundamental core of Islamic life. And that is your profession or your confession of faith. There is no Allah but Allah. And Muhammad is his prophet. The practice of praying at least 3, and for some 5 times a day. They're prescribed times that you do that. They're prescribed the ways that you do that. Without fail. Then there are the fasts. And there again, they have prescribed times and days. The one people are most familiar with is the fast of the month of Ramadan. And you need to remember that the fast is only a daytime fast. As soon as it gets dark, you eat. Now that, of course, is a real problem when you live in a hot country and you're not supposed to even drink much either. To go all day long and not eat anything or drink hardly anything is not an easy thing to do. But you're not talking about a life-threatening, life-challenging event even, because in the evening you get to eat. The 4th pillar is almsgiving. And in the tradition of Islam, the alms, unlike the Jewish alms, does not come from the increase, the tithe. The almsgiving comes from your wealth. And the percentage that you're supposed to give. And then the final pillar is the pilgrimage. You should go to Mecca at least once in your life. And when we look at the faith more completely, we'll look at a little bit more detail about a couple of these things. And we've run out of time. Any question Anybody have? Okey doke. We'll see you next week. And we'll look at that part of the discussion where he deals with their view of God, their view of humanity, and that kind of thing, the judgment. And then we'll look at a little bit more detail within that of the differences between some of the major groups. He has a long section about the Sufis. I don't see her. I don't see her. She can get the recording without any trouble. Yeah. Okay. See you all next week.
Yes, sir. Have a blessed week.
You too.